What did you do? Demanded Ingmei Singh. I don't know, gasped Keeler. The Iterator was reading from a book, and that thing just appeared from nowhere. What in the name of the Emperor is it? A beast from beyond the gates of the Imperium, said Ingmei Singh, as the door shook with another burning impact. I felt the build-up of warp energy, and got here as quickly as I could. Shame you went quicker, eh? Said Keeler. Can you send it back? Ingmei Singh shook her head as a thrashing pseudopod of pinkish light flicked through the door and grazed Keeler's arm. Its touch seared through her robes and burned her skin. She screamed, flinching from the door, and gripped her arm in agony. The horror slammed into the door once more, and the impact sent her and the astropath flying. Blinding light filled the passageway, and Keeler shielded her eyes as she felt hands upon her shoulders, seeing that Kirill Sinderman was on his feet once more. He dragged her to her feet and said, I think I may have mistranslated part of the book. You think? Snapped Keeler as they backed away from the abomination. Or maybe you translated it just perfectly, said Ingmei Singh, desperately scrambling away from the archive chamber's door. The beast of light oozed outwards in a slithering loop of limbs, each one thrashing in blind hunger. Multitudinous eyes rippled and popped like swollen boils across its rubbery skin as it came towards them once more. Oh, Emperor, protect us, whispered Keeler as she turned to run. The beast shuddered at her words, and Ingmei Singh tugged on her sleeve, crying, Come on, we can't fight it. Euphrates Keeler suddenly realized that wasn't true, and shrugged off the astropath's grip. Reaching beneath her robes to pull out the imperial eagle she kept on the end of her necklace. Its silver surfaces shone in the creature's dazzling light, brighter than it had any reason to be, and feeling hot in her palm. She smiled beatifically, as she understood with complete clarity that everything since the Whisperheads had been preparing her for this moment. Euphrates, come on! Shouted Sinderman in terror. A whipping limb formed from the horror's body, and another gout of blue fire roared towards her. Keeler stood firm before it and held the symbol of her faith out in front of her. The Emperor protects! She screamed, as the flames washed over her. Rain fell in heavy sheets, and Loken could feel a tangible charge to the night air, as dark thunderheads pressed down on the tens of thousands of people gathered around the Delphos. Lightning bolts fenced above him, and the sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. 9 days had passed since the War Master had been interred within the temple of the Serpent Lodge, and with each passing day the weather had worsened. Rain fell in an unending downpour that threatened to wash away the makeshift camps of the pilgrims, and booming peals of thunder shook the sky like ringing hammer blows. The War Master had once told Loken that the cosmos was too large and sterile for melodrama, but the skies above Davin seemed determined to prove him wrong. Torgadden and Vipus stood with him at the top of the steps, and hundreds of the sons of Horus followed behind the three of them. Company captains, squad leaders, file officers, and warriors had come to Davin to witness what would be either their salvation or their undoing. They had marched through the singing crowds, the dirty beige robes of remembrancers mixed in with army uniforms and civilian dress. "Looks like the entire bloody expedition's here," Torgadden had said as they marched up the steps, trampling trinkets and baubles left as offerings to the War Master beneath their armoured boots. From the top of the processional steps, Loken could see the same group he had faced 9 days previously, with the exception of Malikhurst, who had returned to the ship some days before. Rain ran down Loken's face as a flash of lightning lit up the surface of the great bronze gateway, making it shine like a great wall of fire. The gathered Astartes warriors stood sentinel before it in the rain. Abaddon, Aximand, Targos, Sedire, Ekadon, and Kyber. None of them had abandoned their vigil before the gates of Delphos, and Loken wondered if they had bothered to eat, drink, or sleep since he had last laid eyes upon them. "What do we do now, Garvey?" asked Vipers. "We join our brothers and wait." "Wait for what?" "We'll know that when it happens," said Torgadden. "Won't we, Garvey?" "I certainly hope so, Tarek," replied Loken. "Come on." The three of them set off towards the gateway, the thunder echoing from the massive structure's sides, and the snakes atop each pillar slithering with each flashing bolt of lightning. Loken watched as his brothers in front of the gate came to stand in line at the edge of the rippling pool of water, the full moon reflected in its black surface. Horus Aximand had once called it an omen. Was it again? Loken didn't know whether to hope that it was or not. The sons of Horus followed their captains down the wide processional steps in their hundreds, and Loken kept a grip on his temper, knowing that if things went ill here, there would almost certainly be bloodshed. The thought horrified him, and he hoped with all his heart that such a tragedy could be averted. But he would be ready if it came to war. "Are you battle-ready?" hissed Loken to Torgadden and Vipers on a discreet Vox channel. "Always," nodded Torgadden. "Full load on every man." "Yes," said Vipers. "You really think?" "No," said Loken, "but be ready in case we need to fight. Keep your humours balanced, and it will not come to that." "You too, Garvey," warned Torgadden. The long column of Astartes warriors reached the pool, the War Master's bearers standing on its opposite side, stoic and unrepentant. "Loken," said Sergar Targost, "are you here to fight us?" "No," said Loken, seeing that, like them, the others were locked and loaded. "We've come to see what happens. It's been 9 days, Sergar." "It has indeed," nodded Targost. "Where is Erebus? Have you seen him since you put the War Master in this place?" "No," growled Abaddon, his long hair unbound and his eyes hostile. "We have not. What does that have to do with anything?" "Calm yourself, Ezekiel," said Torgadden. "We're all here for the same thing." "Loken," said Aximand, "there has been bad blood between us all, but that must end now. For us to turn on one another would dishonor the War Master's memory." "You speak as though he's already dead, Horus." "We will see," said Aximand. "This was always a forlorn hope, but it was all we had." Loken looked into the haunted eyes of Horus Aximand, seeing the despair and doubt that plagued him, and felt his anger towards his brother diminish. Would he have acted any differently had he been present when the decision to inter the War Master had been taken? Could he, in all honesty, say that he would not have accepted the decision of his friends and peers if the situation had been reversed? He and Horus Aximand might even now be standing on different sides of the moon-shimmered pool. "Then let us wait as brothers, united in hope," said Loken, and Aximand smiled gratefully. The palpable tension lifted from the confrontation, and Loken, Torgadden, and Vipers marched around the pool to stand with their brothers before the vast gate. A dazzling bolt of lightning reflected from the gate as the Mournevals stood shoulder to shoulder with one another, and a thunderous boom that had nothing to do with the storm split the night. Loken saw a dark line appear in the center of the gate as the thunder was suddenly silenced and the lightning stilled in the space of a heartbeat. The sky was mystifyingly calm, as though the storm had blown out and the heavens had paused in their revelries, better to witness the unfolding drama on the planet below. Slowly, the gate began to open. The flames bathed Euphrates Keeler, but they were cold, and she felt no pain from them. The silver eagle blazed in her hand, thrust before her like a talisman, and she felt a wondrous energy fill her, rushing through her from the tips of her toes to the shorn ends of her hair. "The power of the Emperor commands you, abomination!" she yelled, the words unfamiliar, but feeling right. Ingmei Singh and Kirill Sinderman watched her in amazement as she took one step, then another, towards the horror. The monster was transfixed. Whether by her courage or her faith, she didn't know, but whatever the reason, she was thankful for it. Its limbs flailed as though some invisible force attacked it, its screeching laughter turning into the pitiful wails of a child. "In the name of the Emperor, go back to the warp, you bastard!" said Keeler, her confidence growing as the substance of the monster diminished, skins of light shearing away from its body. The silver eagle grew hotter in her hand, and she could feel the skin of her palms blistering under its heat. Ingmei Singh joined her, adding her own powers to Keeler's assault on the monster. The air around the astropath grew colder, and Keeler moved her hand close to the psyker in the hopes of cooling the blazing eagle. The monster's internal light was fading and flickering, its nebulous outline spitting embers of light as though it fought to hold on to existence. The light from Keeler's eagle outshone its hellish illumination tenfold, and the entire corridor was bleached shadowless with its brilliance. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it!" cried Ing-mei Sing. "It's weakening!" Keeler tried to answer, but found that she had no voice left. The wondrous energy that had filled her was now streaming from her through the eagle, taking her own strength with it. She tried to drop the eagle, but it was stuck fast to her hand, the red-hot metal fusing itself to her skin. From behind her, Keeler heard the clatter of armored ships' crew and their cries of astonishment at the scene before them. "Please," she whispered, as her legs gave out and she collapsed to the floor. The blazing light faded from her hand, and the last things she saw were the disintegrating mass of the horror and Cinderman's rapturous face staring down at her in wonder. The only sound was that of the gate. Loken's entire existence shrank to the growing darkness between its two halves, as he held his breath and waited to see what might lie beyond. The gates swung fully open, and he risked a glance at his fellow sons of Horus, seeing the same desperate hope in every face. Not a single sound disturbed the night, and Loken felt melancholy rise in him, as he realized that this must simply be the automated opening of the temple doors. The War Master was dead. A sick dread settled on Loken, and his head sank to his chest. Then he heard the sound of footsteps, and looked up to see the gleam of white and gold plate emerge from the darkness. Horus strode from the Delphos with his cloak of royal purple billowing behind him, and his golden sword held high above him. The eye in the center of his breastplate blazed a fiery red, and the laurels at his forehead framed features that were beautiful and terrible in their magnificence. The War Master stood before them, unbowed and more vital than ever, the sheer physicality of his presence robbing every one of them of speech. Horus smiled and said, "You are a sight for sore eyes, my sons." Torgadden punched the air in elation and shouted, "Lupercal!" He laughed and ran towards the War Master, breaking the spell that had fallen on the rest of them. The Mournival rushed to this reunion with their lord and master, joyous cries of "Lupercal!" erupting from the throat of every Astartes warrior as word spread back through the files and into the crowd surrounding the temple. The pilgrims around the Delphos took up the chant, and 10,000 throats were soon crying the War Master's name. "Lupercal! Lupercal! Lupercal!" The walls of the crater shook to deafening cheers that went on long into the night. Part 4. Crusade's End. '18. Brothers. Assassination. This turbulent poet. Silver trails of molten metal had solidified on the breastplate, and Mercity Ollerton had learned enough in her time with the expedition fleet to know that it would require the aid of Legion artificers to repair it properly. Loken sat before her in the training halls, while other officers of the Sons of Horus were scattered throughout it, repairing armor and cleaning bolters or chainswords. Loken was melancholic, and she was quick to notice his somber mood. "Is the war not going well?" she asked, as he removed the firing chamber from his bolter and pulled a cleaning rag through it. He looked up, and she was struck by how much he had aged in the last 10 months, thinking that she would need to revise her chapter on the immortality of the Astartes. Since opening hostilities against the Oretian technocracy, the Astartes had seen some of the hardest fighting since the Great Crusade had begun, and it was beginning to tell on many of them. There had been few opportunities to spend time with Loken during the war, and it was only now that she truly appreciated how much he had changed. "It's not that," said Loken. "The Brotherhood is virtually destroyed, and the warriors of Angron will soon storm the Iron Citadel. The war will be over within the week." "Then why so gloomy?" Loken glanced around to see who else was in the training halls and leaned in close to her. "Because this is a war we should not be fighting." Upon Horus's recovery on Davin, the fleet of the 63rd Expedition had paused just long enough to recover its personnel from the planet's surface and install a new Imperial commander from the ranks of the army. Like Rakris before him, the new Lord Governor-elect, Thomas Vesalius, had begged not to be left behind, but with Darwin once again compliant, Imperial rule had to be maintained. Before the fighting on Darwin, the War Master's fleet had been en route to Sardis and a rendezvous with the 203rd Fleet. The plan was to undertake a campaign of compliance in the Caedes cluster, but instead of keeping that rendezvous, the War Master had sent his compliments and ordered the 203rd's Master of Ships to muster with a 63rd expedition in a binary cluster designated Draconis 311. The War Master told no one why he chose this locale, and none of the stellar cartographers could find reports from any previous expedition as to why this place might be of interest. 16 weeks of warp travel had seen them translate into a system alive with electronic chatter. 2 planets and their shared moon in the second system were discovered to be inhabited, glinting communications satellites ringing each one, and interplanetary craft flitting between them. More thrilling still, communications with orbital monitors revealed this civilization to be human, another lost branch of the old race, isolated these past centuries. The arrival of the Crusade fleet had been greeted with understandable surprise, and then joy as the planet's inhabitants realized that their lonely existence was finally at an end. Formal face-to-face contact was not established for 3 days, in which time the 203rd Expedition, under the command of Angron of the 12th Legion, the World Eaters, translated in system. The first shots were fired 6 hours later. The 9th month of the war. Bolter shells stitched a path towards Loken from the blazing muzzle of the bunker's gun. He ducked behind a shell-pocked cement column, feeling the impacts hammering through it and knowing that he didn't have much time until the gunfire chewed its way through. "Garvey!" shouted Torgadden, rolling from behind cover and shouldering his bolter. "Go left! I've got you!" Loken nodded and dived from behind the cover as Torgadden opened up, his Astartes' strength keeping the barrel level despite the bolter's fearsome recoil. Shells exploded in grey puffs of rockcrete at the bunker's firing slit, and Loken heard screams of pain from within. Locaster moved up behind him, and he heard the whoosh of flame units as warriors poured fire into the bunker. More screams, and the stink of flesh burned by chemical flame filled the air. "Everyone back!" shouted Loken, getting to his feet and knowing what would come next. Sure enough, the bunker mushroomed upwards with a thudding boom, its internal magazine cooking off as its internal sensors registered that its occupants were dead. Heavy gunfire ripped through their position, a collapsed structure at the edge of the central precinct of the planet's towering city of steel and glass. Loken had marveled at the city's elegance, and Peter Egon Momus had declared it perfect when he had first seen the aerial scans. It didn't look perfect now. Puffs of flickering detonations tore a line through the Astartes, and Loken dropped as the warrior with the flame unit disappeared in a column of fire. His armor kept him alive for a few seconds, but soon he was a burning statue. The armor joints fused, and Loken rolled onto his back to see a pair of speeding aircraft rolling around for another strafing run. "Take those ships out!" yelled Loken, as the craft, sleeker, more elegant Thunderhawk variants, turned their guns towards them once again. The Astartes spread out as the underslung gun pods erupted in fire, and a torrent of shells tore through their position, ripping thick columns in two and sending up blinding clouds of grey dust. 2 warriors ducked out from behind a fallen wall, one aiming a long missile tube in the rough direction of the flyer, while the other sighted on it with a designator. The missile launched in a streaming cloud of bright propellant, leaping into the sky and speeding after the closest flyer. The pilot saw it and tried to evade, but he was too close to the ground, and the missile flew straight into his intake, blowing the craft apart from the inside. Its blazing remains plummeted towards the ground as Vipers shouted, "Incoming!" Loken turned to rebuke him for stating the obvious when he saw that his friend wasn't talking about the remaining flyer. 3 tracked vehicles smashed over a low ceramic brick wall behind them, their thick armored forward sections emblazoned with a pair of crossed lightning bolts. Too late, Loken realized the flyers had been keeping them pinned in place, while the armored transports circled around to flank them. Through the smoking wreckage of the burning bunker, he could see blurred forms moving towards them, darting from cover to cover as they advanced. Lacasta was caught between two enemy forces, and the noose was closing in. Loken chopped his hand at the approaching vehicles, and the missile team turned to engage their new targets. Within seconds, one was a smoking wreck as a missile punched through its armor, and its plasma core exploded inside. "Tarek!" he shouted over the din of gunfire from nearby. "Keep our front secure!" Torgadden nodded, moving forwards with 5 warriors. Leaving him to it, Loken turned back towards the armored vehicles as they crunched to a halt, pintle-mounted bolters hammering them with shots. 2 men fell, their armor cracked open by the heavy shells. "Close on them!" ordered Loken, as the frontal assault ramps lowered, and the Brotherhood warriors within charged out. The first few times Loken had fought the Brotherhood, he'd felt a treacherous hesitation seize his limbs, but 9 months of grueling campaigning had pretty much cured him of that. Each warrior was armored in fully enclosed plate, silver like the knights of old, with red and black heraldry upon their shoulder guards. Their form and function was horribly similar to that of the sons of Horus, and though the enemy warriors were smaller than the Astartes, they were nevertheless a distorted mirror of them. Loken and the warriors of Lacasta were upon them, the lead Brotherhood warriors raising their weapons in response to the wild charge. The blade of Loken's chainsword hacked through the nearest warrior's gun and cleaved into his breastplate. The Brotherhood scattered, but Loken didn't give them a chance to recover from their surprise, cutting them down in quick, brutal strokes. These warriors might look like Astartes, but up close they were no match for even one of them. He heard gunfire from behind, and heard Torgadden issuing orders to the men under his command. Stuttering impacts on Loken's leg armor drove him to his knees, and he swept his sword low, hacking the legs from the enemy warrior behind him. Blood jetted from the stumps of his legs as he fell, spraying Loken's armor red. The vehicle began reversing, but Loken threw a pair of grenades inside, moving on as the dull crump of the detonations halted it in its tracks. Shadows loomed over them, and he felt the booming footfalls of the titans of the Legio Mortis as they marched past, crushing whole swathes of the city as they went. Buildings were smashed from their path, and though missiles and lasers reached up to them, the flare of their powerful void shields were proof against such attacks. More gunfire and screams filled the battlefield, the enemy falling back from the fury of the Astartes' counterattack. They were courageous, these warriors of the Brotherhood, but they were hopelessly optimistic if they thought that simply wearing a suit of power armor made a man the equal of an Astartes. "Area secure," came Torgadden's voice over the suit vox. "Where to now?" "Nowhere," replied Loken, as the last enemy warrior was slain. "This is our object point. We wait until the World Eaters get here. Once we hand off to them, we can move on. Pass the word." "Understood," said Torgadden. Loken savored the sudden quiet of the battlefield. The sounds of battle muted and distant, as other companies fought their way through the city. He assigned Vipers to secure their perimeter and crouched beside the warrior whose legs he had cut off. The man still lived, and Loken reached down to remove his helmet, a helmet so very similar to his own. He knew where the release catches were and slid the helm clear. His enemy's face was pale from shock and blood loss, his eyes full of pain and hate, but there were no monstrously alien features beneath the helmet, simply ones as human as any member of the 63rd Expedition. Loken could think of nothing to say to the man, and simply took off his own helmet and pulled the water-dispensing pipe from his gorget. He poured some clear, cold water over the man's face. "I want nothing from you," hissed the dying man. "Don't speak," said Loken. "It will be over quickly." But the man was already dead. "Why shouldn't we be fighting this war?" asked Mercedes Ollerton. "You were there when they tried to assassinate the War Master." "I was there," said Loken, putting down the cleaned firing chamber. "I don't think I'll ever forget that moment." "Tell me about it." "It's not pretty," warned Loken. "You will think less of us when I tell you the truth of it." "You think so? A good documentarist remains objective at all times." "We'll see." The ambassadors of the planet, which Loken had learned was named Aureus, had been greeted with all the usual pomp and ceremony accorded to a potentially friendly culture. Their vessels had glided onto the embarkation deck to surprised gasps, as every warrior present recognized their uncanny similarity to stormbirds. The War Master was clad in his most regal armor, gold-fluted and decorated with the Emperor's devices of lightning bolts and eagles. Unusually for an occasion such as this, he was armed with a sword and pistol, and Loken could feel the force of authority the War Master projected. Alongside the War Master stood Malachhurst, robed in white, Regulus, his gold and steel augmetic body polished to a brilliant sheen, and First Captain Abaddon, who stood proudly with a detachment of hulking Justaran Terminators. It was a gesture to show strength, and, backing it up, 300 sons of Horus stood at parade rest behind the group, noble and regal in their bearing. The very image of the Great Crusade, and Loken had never been prouder of his illustrious heritage. The doors of the craft opened with the hiss of decompression, and Loken had his first glimpse of the Brotherhood. A ripple of astonishment passed through the embarkation deck, as 20 warriors in gleaming silver plate armor, the very image of the assembled Astartes, marched from the landing craft's interior in perfect formation, though Loken detected a stammer of surprise in them, too. They carried weapons that looked very much like a standard-issue bolt gun, though in deference to their hosts, none had magazines fitted.
"Do you see that?"
whispered Loken.
"No, Garvey. I've suddenly been struck blind,"
replied Torgadden.
"Of course I see them. They look like Astartes. There's a resemblance, I'll give you that, but they're far too short. They're wearing power armor. How is that possible?" "If you keep quiet, we might find out," said Torgadden.
The warriors wheeled and formed up around a tall man wearing long red robes, whose features were half flesh, half machine, and whose eye was a blinking emerald gem. Walking with the aid of a golden cog-topped staff, he stepped onto the deck with the pleased expression of one who finds his expectations more than met. The Oretian delegation made its way towards Horus, and Loken could sense the weight of history pressing in on this moment. This meeting was the very embodiment of what the Great Crusade represented. Lost brothers from across the galaxy once again meeting in the spirit of companionship. The red-robed man bowed before the War Master and said,
"Do I have the honor of addressing the War Master Horus?"
"You do, sir.
But please do not bow," replied Horus. "The honor is mine."
The man smiled, pleased at the courtesy.
"Then, if you will permit me, I will introduce myself. I am Emery Salignac, fabricator consul to the Oretian technocracy. On behalf of my people, may I be the first to welcome you to our worlds?"
Loken had seen Regulus's excitement at the sight of Salignac's augmetics, but upon hearing the full title of this new empire, his enthusiasm overcame the protocol of the moment. "Consul," said Regulus, his voice blaring and unnatural, "do I understand that your society is founded on the knowledge of technical data?" Horus turned to the adept of the Mechanicum and whispered something that Loken didn't hear, but Regulus nodded and took a step back.
"I apologize for the adept's forthright questions, but I hope you might forgive his outburst, given that our warriors appear to share certain similarities in their war gear."
"They are the warriors of the Brotherhood," explained Salignac. "They are our protectors and our most elite soldiers. It honors me to have them as my guardians here."
"How is it they are armored so similarly to my own warriors?"
Salignac appeared to be confused by the question and said, "You expected something different, my Lord War Master? The construct machines our ancestors brought with them from Terra are at the heart of our society and provide us with the boon of technology. Though advanced, they do tend towards a certain uniformity of creation." The silence that greeted the consul's words was brittle and fragile, and Horus held up his hand to still the inevitable outburst from Regulus. "Construct machines?" asked Horus, a cold edge of steel in his voice.
"STC machines?"
"I believe that was their original designation, yes," agreed Salignac, lowering his staff and holding it towards the War Master. "You have—" Emery Salignac never got to finish his sentence, as Horus took a step backward and drew his pistol. Loken saw the muzzle flash and watched Emery Salignac's head explode as the bolt blew out the back of his skull. "Yes," said Mercedy Ollerton. "The staff was some kind of energy weapon that could have penetrated the War Master's armor. We've been told this." Loken shook his head. "No. There was no weapon." "Of course there was," insisted Ollerton. "And when the Consul's assassination attempt failed, his Brotherhood warriors attacked the War Master." Loken put down his bolter and said, "Mercedy, forget what you have been told. There was no weapon, and after the War Master killed the Consul, the Brotherhood only tried to escape. Their weapons were not loaded, and they could not have fought us with any hope of success." "They were unarmed?" "Yes." "So what did you do?" "We killed them," said Loken. "They were unarmed, but we were not. Abaddon's Justarin cut half a dozen of them down before they even knew what had happened. I led Locusta forward, and we gunned them down as they tried to board their ship." "But why?" asked Ollerton, horrified at his casual description of such slaughter. "Because the War Master ordered it." "No. I mean, why would the War Master shoot the Consul if he wasn't armed? It doesn't make any sense." "No, it doesn't," agreed Loken. "I watched him kill the Consul, and I saw his face after we had killed the Brotherhood warriors." "What did you see?" Loken hesitated, as though not sure he should answer. At last he said, "I saw him smile." "Smile?" "Yes," said Loken, "as if the killings had been part of his plan all along. I don't know why, but Horus wants this war." Torgadon followed the hooded warrior down the darkened companionway towards the empty reserve armory chamber. Sergar Targost had called a lodge meeting, and Torgadon was apprehensive, not liking the sensation one bit. He had attended only a single meeting since Davin, the quiet order no longer a place of relaxation for him. Though the War Master had been returned to them, the lodge's actions had smacked of subterfuge, and such behavior sat ill with Tarik Torgadon. The robed figure he followed was unknown to him, young, and clearly in awe of the legendary Mournival officer, which suited Torgadon fine. The warrior had clearly only achieved full Astartes status recently, but Torgadon knew that he would already be an experienced fighter. There was no room for inexperience among the sons of Horus. The months of war on Aureus, making veterans or corpses of those raised from the novitiate and scout auxiliaries. The Brotherhood might not have the abilities of the Astartes, but the technocracy could call on millions of them, and they fought with courage and honor. It only made killing them all the harder. Fighting the megarachnids of murder had been easy, their alien physiognomy repulsive to look upon, and therefore easy to destroy. The Brotherhood, though. They were so like the sons of Horus that it was as though two legions fought each other in some brutal civil war. Not one amongst the legion had failed to experience a moment of pause at such a terrible image. Torgadon was saddened as he knew that, like the Interrex before them, the Brotherhood and the Oretian technocracy would be destroyed. A voice from the darkness ahead shook him from his somber thoughts. "Who approaches?" "Two souls," replied the young warrior. "What are your names?" the figure asked, but Torgadon did not recognize the voice. "I can't say," said Torgadon. "Pass, friends." Torgadon and the warrior passed the guardian of the portal and entered the reserve armory. The vaulted chamber was much larger than the aft hold where meetings had commonly been held, and when he stepped into the flickering candlelit space, he could see why Targost had chosen it. Hundreds of warriors filled the armory, each one hooded and holding a flickering candle. Sergar Targost, Ezekiel Abaddon, Horus Aximand, and Malakhurst stood at the center of the gathering. To one side of them stood First Chaplain Erebus. Torgadon looked around at the assembled Astartes and couldn't escape the feeling that this meeting had been called for his benefit.
"You've been busy, Sergar," he said. "Been on a recruiting drive?"
"Since the War Master's recovery on Davin, our stock has risen somewhat," agreed Targost.
"So I see. Must be tricky keeping it secret now."
"Amongst the Legion, we no longer operate under a veil of secrecy."
"Then why the same pantomime to enter?"
Targost smiled apologetically. "Tradition, you understand." Torgadden shrugged and crossed the chamber to stand before Erebus. He stared with undisguised hostility towards the first chaplain and said,
"You have been keeping a low profile since Darwin. Captain Loken wants to speak with you."
"I'm sure he does," replied Erebus. "But I am not under his command. I do not answer to him."
"Then you'll answer to me, you bastard!"
snapped Torgadden, drawing his combat knife from beneath his robes and holding it to Erebus's neck. Cries of alarm sounded at the sight of the knife, and Torgadden saw the line of an old scar running across Erebus's neck.
"Looks like someone's already tried to cut your throat," hissed Torgadden. "They didn't do a very good job of it. But don't worry, I won't make the same mistake."
"Tarik!" cried Sergar Targost. "You brought a weapon? You know they are forbidden."
"Erebus owes us all an explanation,"
said Torgadden, pressing the knife against Erebus's jaw. "This snake stole a Kinnebrak weapon from the Hall of Devices on Zenobia. He's the reason that negotiations with the Interrex failed. He's the reason the War Master was injured." "No, Tarik," said Abaddon, moving to stand next to him and placing a hand on his wrist. "The negotiations with the Interrex failed because they were meant to. The Interrex consorted with Xenos breeds. They integrated with them. We could never have made peace with such people." "Ezekiel speaks the truth," said Erebus.
"Shut your mouth,"
snapped Torgadden.
"Torgadden, put the knife down,"
said Horus Aximand.
"Please."
Reluctantly, Torgadden lowered his arm, the pleading tone of his Mournival brother making him realize the enormity of what he was doing in holding a knife to the throat of another Astartes, even one as untrustworthy as Erebus.
"We are not finished,"
warned Torgadden, pointing the blade at Erebus. "I will be ready," promised the word-bearer. "Both of you be silent," said Targost. "We have urgent matters to discuss that require you to listen. These last few months of war have been hard on everyone, and no one fails to see the great tragedy inherent in fighting brother humans who look so very like us. Tensions are high, but we must remember that our purpose among the stars is to kill those who will not join with us." Torgadden frowned at such a blunt mission statement, but said nothing as Targost continued his speech. "We are Astartes, and we were created to kill and conquer the galaxy. We have done all that has been asked of us, and more, fighting for over 2 centuries to forge the new Imperium from the ashes of old night. We have destroyed planets, torn down cultures, and wiped out entire species, all because we were so ordered. We are killers, pure and simple, and we take pride in being the best at what we do." Cheering broke out at Targost's pronouncements, fists punching the air and hammering bulkheads. But Torgadden had seen the iterators in action enough times to recognize cued applause. This speech was for his benefit, and his alone. Of that he was now certain. "Now, as the Great Crusade draws to a close, we are lambasted for our ability to kill. Malcontents and agitators stir up trouble in our wake with bleating cries that we are too brutal, too savage, and too violent. Our very own Lord Commander of the Army, Hector Varvarus, demands blood for the actions of our grief-stricken brothers who returned the War Master to us while he lay dying. The traitor Varvarus demands that we be called to account for these regrettable deaths, and that we be punished for trying to save the War Master." Torgadden flinched at the word traitor, shocked that Targost would openly use such an incendiary word to describe an officer as respected as Varvarus. But as Torgadden looked at the faces of the warriors around him, he saw only agreement with Targost's sentiment.
"Even civilians now feel they have the right to call us to account," said Horus Aximand,
taking up where Targost had left off and holding up a handful of parchments.
"Dissenters and conspirators amongst the remembrancers spread lies and propaganda that paint us as little better than barbarians."
Aximand circled amongst the gathering, passing out the pamphlets as he spoke.
"This one is called The Truth is All We Have, and it calls us murderers and savages. This turbulent poet mocks us in verse, brothers. These lies circulate amongst the fleet every day."
Torgadden took a pamphlet from Aximand and quickly scanned the paper, already knowing who had written it. Its contents were scathing, but hardly amounted to sedition.
"And this one," cried Aximand. "The Lectitio Divinitatus speaks of the Emperor as a god. A god! Can you imagine anything so ridiculous? These lies fill the heads of those we are fighting for. We fight and die for them, and this is our reward: vilification and hate. I tell you this, my brothers, if we do not act now, this ship of the Imperium, which has weathered all storms, will sink through the mutiny of those on board."
Shouts of anger and calls for action echoed from the armory walls, and Torgadden did not like the ugly desire for reciprocity that he saw on the faces of his fellow warriors.
"Nice speech,"
said Torgadden, when the roars of anger had diminished.
"But why don't you get to the point? I have a company to make ready for a combat drop."
"Always the straight talker, eh, Tarik?" said Aximand.
"That is why you are respected and valued. That is why we need you with us, brother." "With you? What are you talking about?"
"Have you not heard a word that was said?" asked Malachhurst, limping over to where Torgadden stood. "We are under threat from within our own ranks. The enemy within, Tarik. It is the most insidious foe we have yet faced." "You'll need to speak plainly, Mal," said Abaddon. "Tarik needs it spelled out for him."
"Up yours, Ezekiel," said Torgadden.
"I have learned that the remembrancer who writes these treasonous missives is called Ignace Carcassy," said Malachhurst. "He must be silenced."
"Silenced? What do you mean by that?" asked Torgadden. "Given a slap on the wrist? Told not to be such a naughty boy? Something like that?"
"You know what I mean, Tarik," stated Malachhurst.
"I do, but I want to hear you say it."
"Very well. If you wish me to be direct, then I will be. Carcassy must die."
"You're crazy, Mal. Do you know that? You're talking about murder," said Torgadden.
"It's not murder when you kill your enemy, Tarik," said Abaddon. "It's war."
"You want to make war on a poet?" laughed Torgadden. "Oh, they'll tell tales of that for centuries, Ezekiel. Can't you hear what you're saying? Anyway, the Remembrancer is under Garviel's protection. You touch Carcassy, and he'll hand your head to the War Master himself."
A guilty silence enveloped the group at the mention of Loken's name, and the lodge members in front of Torgadden shared an uneasy look. Finally, Malachhurst said, "I had hoped it would not come to this, but you leave us no choice, Tarik." Torgadden gripped the hilt of his combat knife tightly, wondering if he would need to fight his way clear of his brothers. "Put up your knife. We're not about to attack you," snapped Malachhurst, seeing the tension in his eyes.
"Go on,"
said Torgadden, keeping a grip on the knife anyway.
"What did you hope it would not come to?"
"Hector Varvarus claims to have spoken with the Council of Terror about events surrounding the War Master's injury, and it is certain that if he has not yet informed Malcador the Sigillite of the deaths on the embarkation deck, he soon will. He petitions the War Master daily with demands that there be justice."
"And what has the War Master told him?" "I was there too. So was Ezekiel. You too, little Horus."
"And so was Loken," finished Erebus, joining the others. "He led you onto the embarkation deck, and he led the way through the crowd." Torgadden took a step towards Erebus.
"I told you to be quiet!"
He turned from Erebus, and despair filled him as he saw acquiescent looks on his brothers' faces. They had already accepted the idea of throwing Garviel Loken to the wolves.
"You can't seriously be considering this, Mal," protested Torgadden. "Ezekiel? Horus? You would betray your sworn Mornival brother." "He's already betrayed us by allowing this Remembrancer to spread lies," said Aximand. "No, I won't do it," swore Torgadden. "You must," said Aximand. "Only if you, Ezekiel, and I swear oaths that it was Loken who orchestrated the massacre will Varvarus accept him as guilty." "So that's what this is all about, is it?" asked Torgadden. "Two birds with one stone. Make Garviel your scapegoat, and you're free to murder Carcassy. How can you even consider this? The War Master will never agree to it." "Bluntly put. But you are mistaken if you think the War Master will not agree," said Targost. "This was his suggestion." "No," cried Torgadden. "He wouldn't." "It can be no other way, Tarik," said Malachhurst. "The survival of the Legion is at stake." Torgadden felt something inside him die at the thought of betraying his friend. His heart broke at making a choice between Loken and the sons of Horus. But
No sooner had the thought surfaced, he knew what he had to do. He sheathed his combat knife and said,
If betrayal and murder is needed to save the Legion, then perhaps it does not deserve to survive. Garvio Loken is our brother, and you would betray his honor like this? I spit on you for even thinking it.
A horrified gasp spread through the chamber, and angry mutterings closed in on Torgadden.
Think carefully, Tarik, warned Malachhurst. You are either with us or against us.
Torgadden reached into his robes and tossed something silver and gleaming at Malachhurst's feet. The lodge medal glinted in the candlelight.
Then I am against you, said Torgadden.
19. Isolated. Allies. Eagle's wing. Petronella sat at her escritoire, filling page after page with her cramped handwriting, the spidery script tight and intense. Her dark hair was unbound and fell about her shoulders in untidy ringlets. Her complexion had the sallow appearance of one who has not stepped outside her room for many months, let alone seen daylight. A pile of papers beside her was testament to the months she had spent in her luxurious cabin, though its luxury was a far cry from what it had been when she had first arrived on the Vengeful Spirit. The bed was unmade, and her clothes lay strewn where she had discarded them before bed. Her maidservant, Babeth, had done what she could to encourage her mistress to pause in her labours, but Petronella would have none of it. The words of the War Master's valediction had to be transcribed and interpreted in the most minute detail if she was to do his confession any justice. Even though his words had turned out not to be his last, she knew they deserved to be recorded, for she had tapped into the War Master's innermost thoughts. She had teased out information no one had contemplated before, secrets of the Primarchs that had not seen the light of day since the Great Crusade had begun, and truths that would rock the Imperium to its very core. That such things should perhaps remain buried had occurred to her only once in her lonely sojourn. But she was the Palatina Majoria of House Carpinus, and such questions had no meaning. Knowledge and truth were all that mattered, and it would be for future generations to judge whether she had acted correctly. She had a dim memory of speaking of these incredible truths to some poet or other in a dingy bar many months ago, while very drunk, but she had no idea what had passed between them. He had not tried to contact her afterwards, so she could only assume that he hadn't tried to seduce her, or that she hadn't in fact been seduced. It was immaterial. She had locked herself away since the beginning of the war with the technocracy, trawling every fragment of her mnemonic implants for the words and turns of phrase that the War Master had used. She was writing too much, she knew, but damn the word count. Her tale was too important to be constrained by the bindings of a mere book. She would tell the tale for as long as it took in the telling. But there was something missing. As the weeks and months had passed, the gnawing sensation that something wasn't gelling grew from a suspicion to a certainty, and it had taken her until recently to realize what that was. Context. All she had were the War Master's words. There was no framework to hang them upon, and without that, everything was meaningless. Finally realizing what was amiss, she sought out Astartes warriors at every opportunity, but hit her first real obstacle in this regard. No one was speaking to her. As soon as any of her subjects knew what Petronella wanted, or who she was, they would clam up and refuse to speak another word, excusing themselves from her presence with polite abruptness. Everywhere she had turned, she ran into walls of silence, and despite repeated entreaties to the office of the War Master to intervene, she was getting nowhere. Every one of her requests for an audience with the War Master was declined, and she soon began to despair of ever finding a means of telling her tale. Inspiration as to how to break this deadlock had come yesterday, after yet another afternoon of abject failure. As always, Maggard escorted her, clad in his golden battle armor and armed with his Curlian rapier and pistol. After the fighting on Davin, Maggard had made a speedy recovery, and Petronella had noticed a more cocksure swagger to his step. She also noticed that he was treated with more respect around the ship than she was. Of course, such a state of affairs was intolerable, despite the fact that it made his vigor as her concubine that much more forceful and pleasurable. An Astartes warrior had nodded in respect as Petronella despondently travelled along the upper decks of the ship towards her stateroom. She had made to nod back before realizing that the Astartes had been paying his respects to Maggard, not her. A scroll upon the Astartes' shoulder guard bore a green crescent moon, marking him out as a veteran of the Darwin campaign, and thus no doubt aware of Maggard's fighting prowess. Indignation surged to the surface, but before Petronella said anything, an idea began to form, and she hurried back to the stateroom. Petronella had stood Maggard in the centre of the room and said, "It's so obvious to me now. Shame on me for not thinking of this sooner." Maggard looked puzzled, and she moved closer to him, stroking her hand down his moulded breastplate. He seemed uncomfortable with this, but she pressed on, knowing that he would do anything for her, in fear of reprisal should he refuse. "It's because I am a woman," she said. "I'm not part of their little club." She moved behind him and stood on her tiptoes, placing her hands on his shoulders. "I'm not a warrior. I've never killed anyone. Well, not myself. And that's what they respect. Killing. You've killed men, haven't you, Maggard?" He nodded curtly. "Lots?" Maggard nodded again, and she laughed. "I'm sure they know that too. You can't speak to boast of your prowess, but I'm sure the Astartes know it. Even the ones that weren't on Darwin will be able to see that you're a killer." Maggard licked his lips, keeping his golden eyes averted from her. "I want you to go amongst them," she ordered. "Let them see you. Inveigle yourself into their daily rituals. Find out all you can about them, and each day we will use the Nemo quill to transcribe what you've discovered. You're mute, so they'll think you simple. Let them. They will be less guarded if they think they humour a dolt." She could see that Maggard was unhappy with this task, but his happiness was of no consequence to her, and she had sent him out the very next morning. She had spent the rest of the day writing, sending Babeth out for food and water when she realized she was hungry, and trying different stylistic approaches to the introduction of her manuscript. The door to her stateroom opened, and Petronella looked up from her work. The chronometer set into the escritoire told her that it was late afternoon, ship time. She swiveled in her chair to see Maggard enter her room and smiled, reaching over to pull her data slate close and then lifting the Nemo quill from the Leith well. "You spent time with the Astartes?" she asked. Maggard nodded. "Good," said Petronella, sitting the reactive nib on the slate and clearing her mind of her own thoughts. "Tell me everything," she commanded, as the quill began to scratch out his thoughts. The War Master's sanctum was silent, save for the occasional hissing mechanical hum from the exo-armature of Regulus's body, and the rustle of fabric as Malakhurst shifted position. Both stood behind the War Master, who sat in his chair at the end of the long table, his hands steepled before him, and his expression thunderous. "The Brotherhood should be carrying food by now," he said. "Why have the World Eaters not yet stormed the walls of the Iron Citadel?" Captain Khan, equerry to Angron himself, stood firm before the War Master's hostile stare, the dim light of the sanctum reflecting from the blue and white of his plate armor.
"My lord, its walls are designed to resist almost every weapon we have available. But I assure you, the fortress will be ours within days," said Khan.
"You mean mine," growled the War Master.
"Of course, Lord War Master," replied Khan.
"And tell my brother Angron to get up here. I haven't seen hide nor hair of him in months. I'll not have him sulking in some muddy trench avoiding me just because he can't deliver on his promises."
"If I may be so bold, my Primarch told you that this battle would take time," explained Khan. "The Citadel was built with the old technology, and needs siege experts like the Iron Warriors to break it open."
"And if I could contact Perturabo, I would have him here," said the War Master. Regulus spoke from behind the War Master. "The STC machines will be able to counter much of the Mechanicum's arsenal. If the Dark Age texts are correct, they will adapt and react to changing circumstances, creating ever more cunning means of defense."
"The Citadel may be able to adapt," said Captain Khan, angrily gripping the haft of his axe, "but it will not be able to stand before the fury of the 12th Legion. The sons of Angron will tear the beating heart from that fortress for you, War Master. Have no doubt of that."
"Fine words, Captain Khan," said Horus.
Now, storm that citadel for me. Kill everyone you find within.
The World Eater bowed and turned on his heel, marching from the sanctum. Once the doors slid shut behind Khan, Horus said,
That ought to light a fire under Angron's backside. This war is taking too damn long. There is other business to be upon.
Regulus and Malaghurst came around from behind the War Master, the equerry taking a seat to ease his aching body. "We must have those STC machines," said Regulus.
Yes, thank you, Adept. I had quite forgotten that, said Horus. I know very well what those machines represent, even if the fools who control them do not.
My order will compensate you handsomely for them, my lord, said Regulus.
Horus smiled and said, At last we come to it, Adept.
Come to what, my lord?
Do not think me a simpleton, Regulus, cautioned Horus. I know of the Mechanicum's quest for the ancient knowledge. Fully functional construct machines would be quite a prize, would they not?
Beyond imagining, admitted Regulus. To rediscover the thinking engines that drove humanity into the stars and allowed the colonization of the galaxy is a prize worth any price.
Any price?
Asked Horus. These machines will allow us to achieve the unimaginable, to reach into the halo stars and perhaps even other galaxies, said Regulus. So, yes, any price is worth paying.
Then you shall have them, said Horus.
Regulus seemed taken aback by such a monumentally grand offer, and said, I thank you, War Master. You cannot imagine the boon you grant the Mechanicum. Horus stood encircled behind Regulus, staring unabashedly at the remnants of flesh that clung to his metallic components. Shimmering fields contained the adept's organs, and a brass musculature gave him a measure of mobility.
There is little of you that can still be called human, isn't there? Asked Horus. In that regard you are not so different from myself, or Malaghurst.
My lord, replied Regulus, I aspire to the perfection of the machine state, but would not presume to compare myself with the Astartes.
As well you should not, said Horus,
continuing to pace around the sanctum.
I will give you these construct machines, but as we have established, there will be a price.
Name it, my lord. The Mechanicum will pay it.
The Great Crusade is almost at an end, Regulus, but our efforts to secure the galaxy are only just beginning, said Horus, leaning over the table and planting his hands on its black surface. I am poised to embark on the greatest endeavor imaginable, but I need allies, or all will come to naught. Can I count on you and the Mechanicum?
What is this great endeavor? Asked Regulus.
Horus waved his hand and came around the table to stand next to the adept of the Mechanicum once more, placing a reassuring hand on his brass armature. No need to go into the details just now, he said. Just tell me that you and your brethren will support me when the time comes, and the construct machines are yours. A whirring mechanical arm wrapped in gold mesh swung over the table and placed a polished machine cog gently on its surface.
As much of the Mechanicum as I command is yours, War Master, promised Regulus, and as much strength as I can muster from those I do not.
Horus smiled and said, Thank you, Adept. That's all I wanted to hear. On the 6th day of the 10th month of the war against the Oretian technocracy, the 63rd expedition was thrown into panic when a group of vessels translated in-system behind it, in perfect attack formation. Boas Comnenus attempted to turn his ships to face the new arrivals, but even as the maneuvers began, he knew it would be too late. Only when the mysterious ships reached and then passed optimal firing range did those aboard the Vengeful Spirit understand that the vessels had no hostile intent. Relieved hails were sent from the War Master's flagship to be met with an amused voice that spoke with a cultured accent of old terror.
Horus, my brother, said the voice, it seems I still have a thing or two to teach you.
On the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus said, Fulgrim. Despite the hardships of the war, Loken was excited at the prospect of meeting the warriors of the Emperor's children once again.
He had spent as much time as his duties allowed in repairing his armour, though he knew it was still in a sorry state. He and the Mournival stood behind the War Master as he waited proudly on the upper transit dock of the Vengeful Spirit, ready to receive the Primarch of the Third Legion. Fulgrim had been one of the War Master's staunchest supporters since his elevation to War Master, easing the concerns of Angron, Perturabo, and Cursor when they raged against the honour done to Horus and not them. Fulgrim's voice had been the breath of calm that had stilled bellicose hearts and soothed ruffled pride. Without Fulgrim's wisdom, Loken knew that it was unlikely that the War Master would ever have been able to command the loyalty of the Legion so completely. He heard metallic scrapes from beyond the pressure door. Loken had seen Fulgrim once before at the Great Triumph on Ulanor, and even though it had been from a distance as he had marched past with tens of thousands of other Astartes warriors, Loken's impression of the Primarch had never faded from his mind. It was such a palpable honour to stand once again in the presence of two such godlike beings as the Primarchs. The eagle-stamped pressure door slid open, and the Primarch of the Emperor's children stepped onto the Vengeful Spirit. Loken's first impression was of the great golden eagle's wing that swept over Fulgrim's left shoulder. The Primarch's armour was brilliant purple, edged in bright gold and inlaid with the most exquisite carvings. Hooded bearers carried his long, scaled cloak, and trailing parchments hung from his shoulder guards. A high collar of deepest purple framed a face that was pale to the point of albinism, the eyes so dark as to be almost entirely pupil. The hint of a smile played around his lips, and his hair was a shimmering white. Loken had once called Hasta Sejanus a beautiful man, adored by all, but seeing the Primarch of the Emperor's children up close for the first time, he knew that his paltry vocabulary was insufficient for the perfection he saw in Fulgrim. Fulgrim opened his arms, and the two Primarchs embraced like long-lost brothers. "It has been too long, Horus," said Fulgrim. "It has, my brother, it has," agreed Horus. "My heart sings to see you. But why are you here? You are prosecuting a campaign throughout the Purdus anomaly. Is the region compliant already?" "What worlds we found there are now compliant, yes," nodded Fulgrim, as four warriors stepped through the pressure door behind him. Loken smiled to see Saul Tarvitz, his patrician features unable to contain his relish at being reunited with his brothers of the Sons of Horus. Lord Commander Eidolon came next, looking as unrepentantly viperous as Torgadon had described him. Lucius the swordsman came next, still with the same sardonic expression of superiority that he remembered, though his face was now heavily scarred. Behind him came a warrior Loken did not recognize, a sallow-skinned Astartes in the armour of an apothecary, with gaunt cheeks and a long mane of hair as white as that of his Primarch. Fulgrim turned from Horus and said, "I believe you are already familiar with some of my brothers, Tarvitz, Lucius, and Lord Commander Eidolon, but I do not believe you have met my chief apothecary, Fabius." "It is an honour to meet you, Lord Horus," said Fabius, bowing low. Horus acknowledged the gesture of respect and said, "Come now, Fulgrim. You know better than to try to stall me. What's so important that you turn up here unannounced and give half my crew heart attacks?" The smile fell from Fulgrim's pale lips, and he said, "There have been reports, Horus." "Reports? What does that mean?" "Reports that things are not as they should be," replied Fulgrim. "That you and your warriors should be called to account for the brutality of this campaign. Is Angron up to his usual tricks?" "Angron is as he has always been." "That bad?" "No. I keep him on a short leash, and his equerry Khan seems to curb the worst of our brother's excesses." "Then I have arrived just in time." "I see," said Horus. "Are you here to relieve me, then?" Fulgrim could keep a straight face no longer, and laughed, his dark eyes sparkling with mirth. "Relieve you? No, my brother. I am here so that I can return and tell those fops and scribes on Terra that Horus fights war the way it is meant to be fought. Hard, fast, and cruel."
War is cruelty. There is no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it is over.
Fulgrim said, "Indeed, my brother. Come, there is much for us to talk about, for these are strange times we live in. It seems our brother Magnus has once again done something to upset the Emperor, and the Wolf of Fenris has been unleashed to escort him back to Terra."
Magnus?
asked Horus, suddenly serious. "What has he done?" "Let us talk of it in private," said Fulgrim. "Anyway, I have a feeling my subordinates would welcome the chance to reacquaint themselves with your, what do you call it, Mournival?"
"Yes,"
smiled Horus.
"Memories of murder, no doubt."
Loken felt a chill travel down his spine as he recognized the smile on Horus's face, the same one he had worn right after he had blown out the Oresian consul's brains on the embarkation deck. With Horus and Fulgrim gone, Abaddon and Aximand, together with Eidolon, followed the two Primarchs, while Loken and Torgadden exchanged greetings with the Emperor's children. The sons of Horus welcomed their brothers with laughter and crushing bear hugs, the Emperor's children with decorum and reserve. For Torgadden and Tarvitz, it was a reunion of comrades, with a mutual respect forged in the heat of battle, their easy friendship clear for all to see. The apothecary, Fabius, requested directions to the Medicae deck and excused himself with a bow upon receiving them. Lucius remained with the two members of the Mournival, and Torgadden couldn't resist baiting him just a little.
"So, Lucius, you fancy another round in the training cages with Garviel? From the look of your face, you could do with the practice."
The swordsman had the good grace to smile, the many scars twisting on his flesh, and said, "No, thank you. I fear I may have grown beyond Captain Loken's last lesson. I would not want to humble him this time."
"Come on, just one bout," asked Loken. "I promise I'll be gentle." "Yes, come on, Lucius," said Tarvitz. "The honor of the Emperor's children is at stake."
Lucius smiled. "Very well, then." Loken could not remember much of the bout. It had been over so quickly. Evidently, Lucius had indeed learned his lesson well. No sooner had the practice cage shut than the swordsman attacked. Loken had been ready for such a move, but even so was almost overwhelmed in the first seconds of the fight. The two warriors fought back and forth, Torgadden and Saul Tarvitz cheering from outside the practice cages. The bout had attracted quite a crowd, and Loken wished Torgadden had kept word of it to himself. Loken fought with all the skill he could muster, while Lucius sparred with a casual playfulness. Within moments, Loken's sword was stuck in the ceiling of the practice cage, and Lucius had a blade at his throat. The swordsman had barely broken sweat, and Loken knew that he was hopelessly outclassed by Lucius. To fight Lucius with life and death resting on the blades would be to die, and he suspected that there was no one in the Sons of Horus who could best him. Loken bowed before the swordsman and said, "That's one each, Lucius." "Care for a decider?" smirked Lucius, dancing back and forth on the balls of his feet and slicing his swords through the air. "Not this time," said Loken. "Next time we meet, we'll put something serious on the outcome, eh?" "Any time, Loken," said Lucius. "But I'll win. You know that, don't you?" "Your skill is great, Lucius. But just remember, there's someone out there who can beat you." "Not in this lifetime," said Lucius. The Quiet Order met once again in the armory, though this was a more select group than normally gathered, with Lodgemaster Sergar Targost presiding over an assemblage of the Legion's senior officers. Aximand felt a pang of regret and loss as he saw that, of the Legion's captains, only Loken, Torgadden, Yacton Cruz, and Tybalt Mar were absent. Candles lit the armory, and each captain had dispensed with his hooded robe. This was a gathering for debate, not theatrics. "Brothers," said Targost, "this is a time for decisions. Hard decisions. We face dissent from within, and now Fulgrim arrives out of the blue to spy on us."
"Spy?"
said Aximand.
"Surely you don't think that Fulgrim would betray his brother? The War Master is closer to Fulgrim than he is to Sanguinius."
"What else would you call him?" asked Abaddon. "Fulgrim said as much when he arrived."
"Fulgrim is as frustrated by the situation back on Terra as we are," said Malakhurst. "He knows that those who desire the outcome of war do not desire to see the blood of its waging. His legion seeks perfection in all things, especially war, and we have all seen how the Emperor's children fight, with unremitting ruthlessness and efficiency. They may fight differently from us, but they achieve the same result. When Fulgrim's warriors see how the war is fought on Aureus, they will know that there is no honor in it," added Luke Cedere. "The World Eaters shock even me. I make no secret of the fact that I live for battle and revel in my ability to kill, but the sons of Angron are uncivilized. They do not fight, they butcher." "They get the job done, Luke,"
said Abaddon. "That's all that matters. Once the Titans of the Mechanicum break open the walls of the Iron Citadel, you'll be glad to have them by your side when it comes time to storm the breaches." Cedere nodded and said, "There is truth in that. The War Master wields them like a weapon, but will Fulgrim see that?"
"Leave Fulgrim to me, Luke,"
said a powerful voice from the shadows, and the warriors of the Quiet Order turned in surprise as a trio of figures emerged from the darkness. The lead figure was armored in ceremonially adorned armor, the white plates shimmering in the candlelight, and the red eye on his chest plate glowing with reflected fire. Aximand and his fellow captains dropped to their knees as Horus entered their circle, his gaze sweeping around his assembled captains.
"So, this is where you've been gathering in secret."
"My lord," began Targost, but Horus held up his hand to silence him.
"Hush, Sergar,"
said Horus.
"There's no need for explanations. I have heard your deliberations and come to shed some light upon them, and to bring some new blood to your Quiet Order."
As he spoke, Horus gestured to the two figures that had accompanied him to come forward. Aximand saw that one was an Astartes, Tybalt Mar, while the other was a mortal, clad in gold armor, the warrior who had fought to protect the War Master's documentarist on Davin.
"Tybalt you already know," continued the War Master. "Since the terrible death of Verulam, he has struggled to come to terms with the loss. I believe he will find the support he needs within our order. The other is a mortal, and though not Astartes, he is a warrior of courage and strength."
Sergar Targost raised his head and said,
"A mortal within the Order? The Order is for Astartes only."
"Is it, Sergar? I was led to believe that this was a place where men were free to meet and converse, and confide outside the strictures of rank and martial order." "The War Master is right," said Aximand, rising to his feet. "There is only one qualification a man needs to be a part of our Quiet Order. He must be a warrior."
Targost nodded, though he was clearly unhappy with the decision.
"Very well. Let them come forward and show the sign," he said.
Both Mar and the gold-armored warrior stepped forward and held out their hands. In each palm, a silver lodge medal glinted.
"Let them speak their names," said Targost.
"Tybalt Mar,"
said the captain of the 18th Company.